everyone. Welcome back to Conversations of the Leaky Cauldron, Episode 8, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Chapters 31 through 37. And back with me are my esteemed colleagues, Miss Sarah Miller from afar and Mr. Wesley Schantz. And welcome back, you two, and welcome back, Sarah, from the middle of the country.
Yeah, hey how's
y'all.
it going?
And so let's just jump right in today. And we had a pretty healthy chunk of reading. We had Chapter 31, The Third Task, Chapter 32, Flesh, Blood, and Bone, 33, The Death Eaters, 34, Priori Incantatum, 35, Verata Serum, a lot of Latin here, 36, The Pardon of the Ways, 37, The Beginning. I suppose that contrasts with episode, I thought maybe chapter 1, but no. So where did you all want to start today? Where quite a bit has been revealed to us in these last moments, and some very unexpected things have happened, and have we learned. Voldemort has come back. Mad-Eye Moody was not the man we thought he was. Perhaps Barty Crouch was not the man we thought he was. Perhaps Ludo Bagman was not the man we thought he was, though I think we learned that last time. And I suppose one of the themes we've been talking about is layers, and how as we go through these books, we develop a more developed perspective on the wizarding world. It becomes more human, more like the primary world, as Sarah and Tolkien would say. And that we're seeing the dark underbelly of the books. And I'm not going to spoil it, but getting into that fifth book, I think we're really going to see that hypothesis borne out. But what did y'all think about these concluding chapters and in relation to that theme? And what is it that we learned that sort of expanded our notion of what the wizarding world is like, and how it's more than just people with funny green hats and ridiculous names?
I might have missed it, but did you mention that the final chapter is called The Beginning?
I'm not sure if I did or didn't. But
Okay.
yeah.
So, I mean, I think that in itself is kind of surprising in a couple of ways, because, you know, you're literally at the end of this very long book, this book considerably longer than any of the others so far, and it's saying you're just at the beginning. So you're like, oh my gosh, there's 3 more books, you know, it's like, this is rad. But it's also, I think it's making the connection for me to Genesis, you know, but I see that everywhere. So I don't know if I'm really seeing that, or I just, you know, I want to see that. But, you know, it sounds a lot like In the Beginning. And it sounds like, you know, she is making a bid for a slightly higher level kind of work of art here than we might have expected when we started, you know, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Although that's pretty impressive sounding in the British title too.
Well, you know, that's interesting too, just to consider what the beginning is, because in the next book we'll see the Order of the Phoenix, and again that phoenix imagery, which is both beginning and ending imagery. Phoenix is born from its own ashes. Life comes from its own death in a Dionysian or Christ-like way. But it's literally Lord Voldemort coming back that's the beginning, right? He is now embodied in a real, true way, not in the way where he had to share a body with Quirrell. And so it's like it's the beginning of the real work against the real enemy. It's like it's the Fellowship of the Ring, not the Hobbit anymore, or something like that. What do you think, Sarah?
Oh yeah, we are not in Hobbit territory anymore, fellas. And we have like left the Shire for sure.
Yeah.
I like the idea of the biblical allusion, though. To me, this book, I remember a few podcasts ago, we were talking about how 3 has sort of morphed into 4. You know, the third book sort of represented this summit of kind of what the first 3 were, and the fourth seemed to take a marked departure. And there were 4 surprising tournament champions, and we of course learn why in our reading for today. But you know, like this, the 3 things kind of being pushed into the fourth, like as though the fourth dimension of time is sort of how I think about it. Like these 3 things are now in motion, or incarnate, I think was the thing that was speaking to me around the Christmas time. So I kind of see this sort of as like the beginning of the great battle, right? Like the beginning of the, like if the first three that came were all set up, this is the beginning of evil incarnate, but also I would say good, like matured good incarnate. I mean, I think there's a moment where Dumbledore is explaining to Harry the priori incantatem, and he says like that Harry reached a level of magic that a very good adult wizard would not necessarily have been able to reach. Like something has been altered, and they're at the beginning of kind of this next kind of more grave level. And maybe to answer your original question, Alex, like that's what makes it more real, or more primary like, that the stakes are higher. This isn't just wearing costumes and flicking around wands. This is life and death.
So I think that's great. So it sounds like you're saying things are taking shape, so we can actually sort of notice the pattern of the narrative because of this time element that we now have that's extended this static 3 into this dynamic 4. And just what I like so much about that is the 4th sphere of Dante's heaven, the sun, is the first unobscured by the conical shadow coming off the earth. It is the first sphere in which you see the actual shape that the souls are joined in. Interlocking circles surrounded by a third, because of course it's the sphere of arithmetic, or adding and sharing one's perspective, as we do here as fellow illuminators. And so that's so fascinating that moment literally happens in the Paradiso too, when you can see the narrative taking shape finally, when you have a clear perspective on what's happening. And so instead of simply judging this work by novelty now, it's as if we're now judging it by its own merits, by what it is. I mean, what do you think about that, Wes? What do you think about that, Sarah? Do you agree with that? I'm not sure.
Hey, I was looking up one thing because I agree that we're no longer in Hobbit territory, but I do have to point out that the riddle posed by this particular Sphinx is a very Hobbit-like riddle, I thought. So just to like go to the other bookend allusion, sort of for this portion of the reading, that Sphinx, she's a magnificent beast from ancient myth and literature, but she's also like a very British Sphinx. She asks a riddle which it depends upon the English language. It depends upon the English pronunciation of when you're thinking hard, right, to figure it out. And that's a lot like the final riddle between Bilbo Baggins and Gollum, where Bilbo says he needs more time, and that's the answer to the riddle, right? It's a lot like that, I thought. And so I see what you're saying, like this is a more serious kind of mode that we're in, but in the same, by the same token, it's not that sharp of a break, maybe. And I know that there's a moment kind of like that in the Fellowship where opening the door requires saying friend, and they have a good laugh about it. And then, Frodo gets attacked by the Watcher in the water. But anyway, yeah, so I think there's some interesting like play of levels here. Like it's not like we were just suddenly plunged into gloom. There's still a lot of like joyful things, and we realized that Hagrid and Dumbledore seemed like they really expected this to go this way all the time. Like it was only a matter of time till this kind of came to the surface. So and it's uplifting too at the end. It's like, wow, something impressive is about to happen.
Well, I think the claim is more that it's taking shape and that we can see it clearer now than it's simply becoming darker, even though that is a theme that we've noted. Because, just to take a motif we've seen not only in this book, but in games in general, the labyrinth precedes the reality situation where things finally get real. So there is a break. That portkey, that trophy, takes one into a totally different moment from the simulation in which there are rules and safety out into the quote-unquote real world or unknown territory where all of a sudden somebody dies. And then, there's the wake of death that will follow him through the next book. So, I agree that there are joyful moments too, certainly, but I think what's happening is that we're just getting a deepening understanding of the fullness or the range of experience possible in this world.
Yeah, and I agree. Actually, I agree with what you just said, Alex. I think the labyrinth is a perfect example. And Wes, you're totally right. I actually kind of forgot about the Sphinx's riddle in the labyrinth, and I was racking my brain to be like, did they refer to the Oedipus riddle? And I totally missed that. But anyway, you're right that there's like that's sort of like a hat tip of sorts, I think. I mean, from Rowling to a British classic. What I meant by things sort of like we're not in the Hobbit territory anymore is more like what I know is to come is so much like the stakes seem so much higher, and like the writing seems to be like at a more complex level, or the world making, I guess. But I can't even really say that about Tolkien. But I think I want to just point out one moment where it does seem like the game has fundamentally shifted when Harry goes into the graveyard and he realizes what is happening. Voldemort has been resurrected. He's been wounded. Cedric is dead, and he's being forced to duel, which is a game, right? And he doesn't remember anything from his dueling club except how to disarm. And all of the things that he learned to help him in the labyrinth, they sort of fall out of his head. And he says there's nothing that he had learned that could help him in this moment. He had never learned anything that could quite block against this. He was quite unprotected, I think is the quote I wrote down. And then, after resisting these imperial curses, which I think at some point we have to talk about as well, he says that he knew one thing beyond fear and reason, that if he was going to die, he was going to die upright, trying even if it meant death. That just seems like a whole different version of a game, because the stakes aren't winning or losing, glory or shame. It like things move from a labyrinth game to another kind of game that was way different, and that he oddly felt unprepared, yet totally was prepared for.
That's I think a really interesting way of looking at what Voldemort is up to here by constructing this kind of elaborate game. If he wanted to capture Harry, he could have made pretty much anything a port key, that Harry was going to touch, and get him to touch it, and he'd be through. He would have had Harry that way. But he really goes to a lot of trouble to make sure that Harry wins the tournament, so that in the moment of him winning, at his moment of triumph, as they point out about Cedric, like when he dies, he's at like on the top. He's won the tournament against all odds and all expectations, right? And so that, I think, is exactly how Voldemort felt in the moment when he lost his powers, 13 years prior. And so he wants like Harry to just like go through that moment in reverse is kind of how it feels there. And it's so, the envy and the anger that he must feel, Voldemort, is like so profound. And Rowling does an impressive job of kind of like making us feel that kind of, sinking feeling, like, oh, like this is this kind of book is what we're reading now. Like, so, I thought I was on top of the world reading a fantasy, and now I'm like deep in the circles. It's rough. And then, okay, but then you get the kind of the Song of the Phoenix, the Prioria Incantatum, and it's sort of, I think the turning point is where he's like, no, I'm not going to bow. Like, I'm not going to let this be how Voldemort wants it to be. And you sort of, as the reader, you're like, yeah, okay, there's still hope. Okay.
I'm really curious why that question that you articulated just there, like, can we maybe explore why do we think Voldemort trapped Harry in this way? I think it's fairly clear why they went to the place that they went, but I'm curious why this way, and also what do you think gives Harry the ability to resist. I mean, I think from the story from Barty Crouch, it's apparently possible to resist the Imperio curse, but it seems like for him it took a really long time, and that curse wasn't placed on him by the world's most powerful dark wizard. It was placed on him by his father. So it seems like Harry was able to resist relatively quickly in a time of crisis. Resist the Imperial curse from someone who for damn sure knew how to use it. So I'm curious about both of those things. I wondered what you guys thought.
I have a few thoughts on that. I at the most general level, wonder whether Voldemort and Harry both experience a moment of ultimate triumph, which is, of course, followed by a moment of sort of ultimate defeat, because you find yourself outside of the sort of dominance hierarchy or value structure in which you were climbing when you were fighting for it, right? So like you win the Olympic gold medal and then the next day you're not a swimmer anymore, or you graduate from college and then the next day, you know, you got to go take your minimum wage job at wherever. And rather than being treated like a prince or a princess, you're now sort of a slave. You have that tremendous fall from grace after being a winner for that small amount of time. To that point about Voldemort, this makes me more and more, because of the game he constructs, he more and more strikes me as sort of that archetypal figure of the hostile brother to Harry. They, of course, share the same sort of wand, or the same, phoenix feather within it, which creates the priori incantatem situation. They're very like Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes to me as well. There's sort of this arch villain that constructs games that the hero or the protagonist must be smart enough or skilled enough to get through, except for in this case, Harry needs a lot of help, which is sort of funny. But I do like the sadistic, malevolent idea that Voldemort goes to all this trouble precisely to put Harry through as much pain as he has been through in this moment as well. And I like the idea that what makes Voldemort, say, evil rather than good is precisely in the game that he creates and the parameters that surround it, that he is willing to kill. Though, of course, we know that the Aurors will kill as well. They will meet fire with fire in the wizarding world. That's something we find out. But that it seems like the structure of his game, or the outcomes or intentions behind it, are what differentiate him as malevolent from someone who's good. As if there's a very different desire, as if a very different experience of playing is expected from the game. He wants fear and submission and humiliation to be parts of his game. Whereas if you look at the Triwizard Tournament, it seems like courage and perseverance. And even though there's tremendous danger and threat of death, the desire of the designer seems to bring out the best rather than the worst in man. Maybe that is one way of observing what evil is. I'm not sure. What do you two think? I know I was sort of circumlocuting.
Well, I mean, I think, the question about the why Harry can resist the Imperio curse, I just had a quick thought about that, which is that, you know, Voldemort can make him physically bow right before that. So it's not that he's more powerful than Voldemort in a kind of like direct head-to-head way, but that I think it's the particular thing that Voldemort is trying to get him to do that Harry is capable of resisting, and that's like saying a word, right? I think that that's very important here. That there's something different about, you know, this articulate speech. And we've seen that before. Like that seems very, very significant. The relationship between spells that involve speaking versus spells that are sort of embodied, and like where the borderline is there. I think that we get that sort of drawn out a bit with the priori incantatem thing, where it's like the spells themselves construct still another game within which neither of them really know what's going on, and they're both kind of at a loss. And the spells themselves start to talk to them, which is wild.
yeah, I like the parallel between Moriarty and Holmes. I also think of Edgar and Edmund in King Lear, where but I think that maybe that's where the great weakness is in Voldemort ultimately, is that and we see this in the spell that he himself writes to regenerate himself, which I think is also interesting, that he is the author of his own like re-embodiment, is that he needs Harry in a way that Harry doesn't need Voldemort, right? And I'm always reminded, the more that Voldemort is like this, is a character who has a body and a voice and speaks and acts in the stories, I'm always reminded more and more, and I please correct me if I'm wrong, if you guys understand it, I'm reminded of like some of the ressentiment that I learned about when reading like some of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, or the genealogy of morality, like the need to define yourself against something as opposed to define yourself positively as something, right? He is, like he needs Harry to regenerate, and like that's a great, and I'm sure he understands it as a great weakness as well. And I wonder if like an inability to really accept that or articulate it is somehow a part of this as well. I'm interested too in like the language that he uses when he tells Harry to bow. He says you have to bow to death, which is so interesting because that's the one thing that he has attempted to make himself impervious to, right? That like that's the one thing, the one element of his former humanity that he believes, at least for now, he's like will never happen to him because he's above it, right? But I think that's a pretty clear signal that it's the thing that he most fears, and so that has become the thing that he defines himself over and against. And it seems really like it just seems like a source of weakness that in the moment seems like strength, but because it separates him from people. But I don't know. I find that interesting. Yeah,
I certainly agree that he is like Nietzsche's last man, or the one who engages in or feels ressentiment, and that his goal is lower than Harry's, and thus his standard. Whereas Harry wishes to expurgate evil from the world, Voldemort wishes to humiliate the boy who took everything from him. And so we're in this moment watching this Dark Lord kill a kid and then essentially torture this other kid and then fail to do so in a way that's more humiliating to him than it is to us or to Harry, because who should he be fighting? This fourth-year wizard who's been outmatched by other seventh-year wizards who are by no means Lord Voldemort. This entire tournament, we find out, who needed a ton of help from fake Moody, actual Barty Crouch. And this, he's denigrating himself by reducing himself to torturing a child, essentially. I mean, if he were a true Dark Lord, like a Sauron-like figure, he would be fighting Dumbledore. Let's be frank. Like, Dumbledore is a figure of divine light, God the Father in this, and he should at least have the dignity to lose to him. But I think it's telling that he doesn't. Like you said, there's that phrase about the Romans in relation to the Greeks. In conquering, they were conquered. And it seems that Voldemort, in so trying to escape death, has had his life dominated by it and has invited death so closely into his life. He's so afraid of it, like a snake, he actually keeps a snake which kills next to him, and in fact kills with the killing curse at all times. Death is always surrounding him. He has in no way conquered it, I would say.
Well, absolutely. And like, he seems to sort of know that he's made some pretty big errors here. Like, drinking the unicorn blood and overlooking the magic that saved Harry's life. And now he makes, I think I agree, like, by needing Harry's blood to revive himself in bodily form here, Dumbledore like kind of has this look of triumph, like just for a fleeting, like that's a pretty, I think a pretty good glimpse into like, yeah, there is like ultimately no chance that Voldemort is going to actually win, and that it's interesting insofar as he keeps trying and keeps in every way that he goes head to head against Harry, he just sort of diminishes his own like fearful, awe-inspiring status. His most devoted servant is like completely insane and deranged, right? At least Fudge is right about that much. And so there is something, something to that again, it does seem like you could have a story where you directly pit Voldemort up against Dumbledore, and Dumbledore would win, and it wouldn't be that much of a story. So there has to be all this other. There's got to be the 7 locks on the luggage, right? There's got to be the very experiment only at the very end of the 4th book. You don't get to just like hear the whole story right up front and just like see, okay, well, good versus evil, good wins. Like that's not that interesting of a story, but we can make it a really interesting story if we do a little more with it.
And I think it's precisely the smallness of Voldemort that brings out the greatness of the good of those who fight against him, and even those who were once at his side. The things he does are so petty. And even though he puts on this veneer of culture, which we'll see later in the 5th and 6th books, and here he puts on this foppish, not foppish, but disingenuous display of ritual courtesy during the wand, during the battle scene, right? He doesn't actually believe in what he's doing. He's not doing it to respect conventions. He's doing it he's observing the form in order to humiliate appropriately. Again, he's denigrating the institution, but and his opponent, but in so doing, he denigrates himself, and he's resentfully unmasking his own Death Eaters, and part of the key to his own power was the fact that he kept them secret from each other. He's sloppy. He's angry. He's emotional. He just does. Rather than being this larger than life, he who must not be named, he's very much reduced to the figure of, and I know this is from the movies, the sort of Ralph Fiennes, like very much the human here, I would say, and that seems to be exactly what he's trying not to be. He wants to be a god, and yet he comes out as just a very, very petty human.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, how much power he wields over people. We've been talking about it, how much power the specter of Voldemort, as he who must not be named, how much influence that has over people's way of life, over their language, to your point earlier, Wes, about its power and the way that it reflects who we are, and like the way that it kind of is set above in terms of one of the things that we have the capacity to control than just our physical actions. But he was everywhere, even when he was disembodied. And it's like I think this time around, as I listened and read, I was just struck by how like kind of boring of a villain I found him. Like, I did not find him, I thought he was scarier when you didn't know what he looked like, or when you didn't know where he was or what he was up to. And I guess it sort of surprises me that somebody of his power and capacity wouldn't know that, A, and B, wouldn't. It makes me wonder, when the first rise to power, when like the initial attempts at like some dark order were in the works, it must have been something else too that was powerful and pervasive, because at that time he had a body, and it was his original body. So what was it in combination with him, his incarnate status, that made him so formidable a foe, because in this moment he seems, like you said, petty, vindictive, weak. This grand plan is fooled by a summoning charm, right? Like, yeah. So I'm curious what you all thought about that, or if we want to talk about what we thought about, fake Mad-Eye Moody or something like that. We can also move on.
Well, 2 or 3 things about that are, I wonder how many villains or horror movie monsters survive that test of going from the dark abysses of your imagination with small clues of their existence in the beginning of a text to what they actually physically manifest as in front of you.
Fair.
Like, it was much scarier to me before I saw it as a spider in the 80s movie. But I just think that's very interesting. But I totally agree about Voldemort becoming really smaller than life rather than larger than life, and that his initial rise to power must have been absolutely terrifying. But something about him as sort of a figure of the archetypal enemy or devil is that Harry says "I won't" to him after he tries to get him to articulate no, as Wes was saying. And part of what I think that means is that the power of the devil is to convince you not to use your willpower, or to convince you that you don't have a choice. And that is precisely what Harry rejects, even though he gets a soporific, drug-like, lotus eater, nepenthe-like feeling from it. Apparently it's the easiest thing in the world to give up your willpower. Well, of course, it comes from your highest possible faculty, your intelligence, according to Dante and Aquinas, and that does seem to be correct. To say no to evil is extraordinarily hard, much harder than just giving into it, like most of these other characters. And so it seems like the failing of the Death Eaters is that they give into their fear of death, and that makes them give up their freedom of will to Voldemort. And that it's precisely because Harry does not give in to his fear of death, that he stands upright, that he keeps his willpower, his freedom of will. And that, I think, is ultimately what wins that wand battle for him, that he is rejecting Voldemort, whereas Voldemort is attempting to subjugate him. And the force of rejecting someone else's attempt to subjugate you, I think, is a stronger motivating force. And yeah, that's what I have to say for now, even though I know I didn't address every one of your points.
I
think
I was thinking that same passage, right? The Priori and Cantatum, when they're in the Golden Dome together and their wands are vibrating and the golden thread is connecting them. That does seem like the moment when you see the willpower confront, directly head to head, and Harry is victorious there. And so, yeah, I think in that moment there does seem to be something else along with Harry's will, though, right? This voice that's like a friend speaking in his ear, and the music that's like the Phoenix song, right? So that there is this kind of something else. There's something that his will, when it's in the proper kind of channel, like puts him in touch with. It transcends his own sort of experience or understanding or anything, but it's his will. Yeah, I agree that does seem to be sort of like the gateway to open him up to this other thing, which proves to really just overcome Voldemort. And it has to do with the shadows of those that Voldemort has killed, so it's like his strength is his weakness in this case, and Harry's weakness is his strength.
What do you think that golden chain is? And just to make a connection to the golden ladder of Saturn in the sphere in Paradiso, as well as the golden ladder that Jacob sees, and this golden thread that Zeus says he could drop from the top of heaven and pull up the earth and all the gods along with it, if only he willed. I guess, what do you think this golden thread is? And it seems like you were dancing around, not dancing around, I guess circumlocuting around saying what it is you see. What do you think this something is that he taps into And do you see a connection between this moment and the moment in the second book when Fawkes shows up after the post hoc explanation by Dumbledore that somebody showing extraordinary loyalty to him will receive the appropriate sort of weapon or tool in that moment to vanquish evil by means of good?
It does look a lot like that moment. And yeah, the phoenix, is this very interesting symbol there, which seems to have a lot of kind of facets to it. In this case, it's song, and then later, it's tears again will heal Harry's wound. But it seems like his wound doesn't really bother him all of a sudden after this either. So it's as good as it's healed at that moment. And as I think as far as the golden thread that connects them, I mean, I think that's simply the underlying like unity, which is I think in this conception is good, right? The underlying reality, the ground of reality is basically good. It seems to be the message here. And so the evil that passes over it is ultimately, going to be driven back. It will always find sort of new shapes and new interesting stories to tell, right? And sort of seductive ones probably. But basically, I mean, it does seem to be a message of hope, like ultimate hope.
That's interesting too, just because a claim that Dante has made constantly throughout the Divine Comedy, but especially in the Sphere of Mars, is that the justice of the world is bent and bitter, and that the world has inverted justice, and so the world is essentially hell in an unjust place. And it's so interesting that in the darkest possible place, in a graveyard, where somebody you admired is now dead right next to you, the underlying substructure of reality is golden and beautiful and divine and unified. And that even this struggle within it is part of, the fabric of reality, or the potential within it, which is already allowed for by, the structure of reality, or God the Father, or Dumbledore, or something like that. That's very interesting that there's you see sort of like a secondary world within the secondary world, or a substructure, or an inkling into the substructure of the secondary world, which perhaps, I don't know if either of you would claim is actually the substructure of our world as well. Is that our connection to the text?
Well, I would say that the secondary world is a substructure in the primary world, and any good secondary world is a reflection of its primary world. And maybe insofar as that's the case, they're all sort of mirror images of one another. But no, listen, I think what Alex, what you said a few minutes ago about about willpower, and that you echoed, Wes, that faced with the same choice, faced with the same wand, with the same, not the same wand, but the same course substance, two individuals went in radically different directions. And I think that's sort of what, that golden beam that connects them, I think identifies that, there is, as much as we want to say that Harry is this good hero and Voldemort is this, arch villain, there is a core substance between the two of them, between their two wands, and between their two beings that, that is basic, right? That is foundational, and that the things that come from that, the goodness or the evil or somewhere in between, those are a reflection of how you use what you have, how you apply that willpower or that knowledge or that language or whatever it is that we're going to call these, call our actions derived from it, some combination of those things. But that's their core, and it just so happens that their core is this bird that represents life and death, and that literally represents mortality and immortality at the same time, which I think is fascinatingly paradoxical and I love paradoxes. I'm always mesmerized by them. I don't ever know really what to say about them, but I just think that they are core. They are essential. Like to me, the phoenix is the as ineffable as I find it to explain what it represents beyond, say, life and death. Like, why does it have to represent that? You know, our world is one of paradoxes, and you know, I'm always left with without sufficient words to explain that. But I think that that's sort of what you see. I mean, I when I read this for the first time, I guess I was maybe 14 or 15. I was so interested in like the dome that is created. Maybe I saw a picture of it somewhere. And I remember watching the movie and being so disappointed in the way this was designed in film, because I was really into like imagining this dome with all of these rays and colors and like beams of light and you know, little particles and stuff like that. But I think that it has something to do with like these two people are people, and like what's at their core, you know?
Yeah,
like they're one.
I totally agree, and it's interesting. I was watching a lecture on calculus last night, and this calculus teacher, as passionate as he was sort of inarticulate in being he was not able to articulate why he was so passionate about his subject, which I think is likely a condition that afflicts many in the mathematics and science field. So surely not all, but he was trying to explain what was interesting about being able to take the tangent of a curve. And what he was unable to express about that, besides saying it was cool, is that you take a constant measurement of an inconstant thing. You see something constant passing through that which is inconstant. And so that's what we're seeing now too, I think, that we're seeing immortal roles embodied by new individuals over and over. And I think that's part of what the Phoenix image and also the Dionysus image and also the Easter image is that the roles are eternal, but the participants are not. And that what I think is so interesting about Voldemort coming back to being a hero fighting him, and we see this in Grindelwald too, that there was another evil man before him, and we see that expansion in Tolkien too, that there's not Sauron, there's another bigger principle than he is, but that what is unique about a person is not the role that they play, but how they play the particular role. I guess you could even reduce it to that cliche that it is not your specific role, but how you play it. But what makes this a little more advanced than that is just like with Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes, like I think you said, Sarah, like you illustrated, they're very similar. They're very smart, sharp individuals who spent their whole life devoted to crime in one way or another. And so Harry and Voldemort, and I think this is also the theme in many, many movies and stories, are abilities-wise very similar. Parseltongues, and they're both orphans, and they have this phoenix feather. But what truly differentiates them, what makes it so that they can say, like the hero at the end of a movie, "I'm nothing like you," to the villain, is the side that they fall upon, that they choose to be upon. Voldemort is a world away from Harry, or literally on a different side of the same coin, or figuratively, because it is a figure in our imagination, because of his choice to be evil. Whereas Harry is on the side of good because he chooses to be on good. And they are not similar because of their abilities, but rather utterly dissimilar because of the side they find themselves on, which I think is the basic flaw in Voldemort's and Slytherin's argument for like pure bloods. They seem to think that the most important thing about a person is their abilities and that they have the best abilities. But what the people on the side of good realize is that you need a differentiation of labor. You need Neville just as much as you need Harry for their differing skill sets, but they're all working towards the same common cause, which is to produce, something good in the world, which is a better or stronger or more motivating cause than the evil desire, which is what? To just destroy that which is good, and then they have to build their own thing using principles of good or just die out. I'm not sure, evil, and I know I'm tangenting here, evil, just like the Joker evil in The Dark Knight, doesn't seem to have a plan for after it wins. It seems like it would just have to revert to good to build something new. Or, I guess we can imagine subjugated horror, but even then you would need principles of order and infrastructure.
I think the interesting place to kind of go from there might be to look at Barty Crouch and the way in which he's playing a role through the entire book, and he plays it to a T. And part of that is through the support of the house elf, not telling the truth the entire time, even though, she's being loyal. It's like she's upholding what to her is the highest good, right? To maintain the secrets of her master, which is a good. It's a kind of good, but it's so distorted. And the way that Barty Crouch plays this role is so good. He's like the best Moody, but it's in service of this ultimately deranged kind of notion that he's going to be Voldemort's number one, like a son to him, closer than a son. So it's like trying to find. I think it's a little bit like Wormtail's hand that he gets too. It's like this thing that's trying to make up for something that was cut off, that was good in itself, but was sort of like rejected, and so that they're playing out something which seems good in itself, but is ultimately just impossible to work, right? And you see that. I think you see the reverse of that too with Dumbledore. We finally see Dumbledore in action, and he's terrifying, right? Like he looks scary, but he is good. It's very interesting reversal.
Oh, that's a nice allusion to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan is described by multiple characters as he's not safe. He's not not a safe figure, but he is good, and that he has like enormous capacity to do damage. But yeah, that line where Dumbledore burst into the room, and Harry for the first time understood why Voldemort, why this was the wizard that Voldemort feared him before all else. I loved that line.
Yeah, and just back to the point really quickly of the rejection of the father by Barty Crouch, or the rejection by the father as leading him to seek a substitute or defective father like Voldemort, who he misplaced trust or lust or love, and that just strikes me as the same as the idea behind the Shredder in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, who takes young kids in the sewer and like gives them video games like Pleasure Island from Pinocchio, and then turns them to evil. It recalls to me also the devil in Milton's Paradise Lost, who feels rejected by the father by the production of the son. And then, of course, Voldemort himself, who is an orphan but also kills his own father, which, though it is a fratricide that Cain does, it seems like what each of these figures seems to do is, like you said, Wes, they cut off a branch and then they try and sort of like glue it back on in a different place. I wonder to what extent too that's sort of part of a problem today in our contemporary society, that we think we might be able to replace that which is family in an easier way than we actually can. That is, in fact, rejection of that which we might well do better to improve upon, that leads to the greatest evils of our, in the world.
Well, I mean, the family thing is really complicated. Like, we see that whatever was going on in the Crouch family, it was deeply problematic, right? And I don't know quite what to do. And it kind of comes back to Draco again, who's like, next to Neville and maybe Snape, he's like the most interesting character, Draco. So, like, what do you do for someone like that given this whole kind of framework that we're in? do you sort of like invite him up to Dumbledore's office to look in the pensieve and, listen to the Phoenix sing for a bit? Or does he just kind of have to drink his potion down to the dregs and like sort of see it through? And that's the only way that he's going to get there.
What do you mean, what do we do for a person like Draco? Do you mean like, do we have to let them come around to their worldview being or in need of alteration? Or do you I'm not clear what your question is just yet.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. I mean, just like we see how complex problems are going off of the family idea, right? Like that's a kind of essential problem which pre-exists any individual, and you're born into it and you've got to kind of manage with it. If you get going the wrong direction, it seems really difficult to clear up the confusion and set you back on track, right? And so in these cases, like Voldemort is just digging himself deeper, and Crouch likewise. And so I sort of wonder about old Draco there. If there is something that could be done for him, or if it's sort of already just a matter of letting him see where this path is taking him.
I think it's neither, and I think that what comes through, especially in the next book as well, is because we'll see examples of people diverging from their families, right? We'll see Percy do this. We'll see how Sirius has done this. We'll see how Harry is accused of doing this in a negative way. I think what we'll see more and more is that it's not what someone else can do for you. You are the effect of your choices, regardless of your family. I think we'll see that with Neville. I think we see that with Harry. I think we see that with Ron differentiating himself from all his family members. That, yes, we see that lots of people have had hard lives. Neville, for sure. Draco, he's getting it from all sides. Hermione, Muggle, Harry too. But that it's ultimately one's choices, not one's situation, that dictates who one is and how one is the same as or different from one's family. And I think that's what we really see in this series, because not even Draco is the same as Lucius, as similar as they are with their similar chins and hair.
So I do think, to your question, Wes, I think there's and it's funny, like the real world analog of this is like we have students, right, who are heavily affected by their parents. Sometimes that's really good, and sometimes it's like, well, I know where you learn this behavior because I've seen your parents behave this way, and there's like a degree to which I can't do anything about this. There are certain behaviors that are learned, and there are certain things that are they're learned at home or they're learned elsewhere. I think if we are the sum of our choices, I think the only thing that we can do for other people is provide them opportunities to make new choices, right? So
that's excellent.
Like practicing, and we see Harry do this much to his he thinks it's wrong, or Ron thinks it's weak. And I think we see, like, there's a part of us that wants punishment for a series of bad choices that Draco makes. That kid deserves some punishment, right? But and when he gets turned into a ferret, it's kind of funny, and he kind of deserves it, right? But if we really do believe that we are the sum of our choices, then we're also more than the worst choice we've ever made, because we're still alive and there's the opportunity to make another choice the next day. Now, there may be some things that we could choose to do that are unforgivable, right? And I'm super interested in like the fact that somebody like Barty Crouch uses the Imperial Curse on his own son, right? And this is a dark wizard hunter who resorts to things that are considered unforgivable curses out of fear, out of shame, out of a series of poor reasons, right? And there is a degree to which in like civil society or in like a so-called just society, there have to be punishments for bad behaviors, right? But and those punishments have like social benefits, not the least of which is keeping people safe. But like the kind, like extreme punishments that deny people the opportunity to make better choices the next time, to say learn or grow, or I think that that's a really important part of this, that like you know, what we'll see later, and I think principally in the 7th book, but also in the 6th book, you know, Dumbledore models this, I think, pretty nicely for someone like Snape, and for someone like Draco, that like you can write people off, but every time you do that, you reduce the possibility that they could be, say, quote unquote, saved, or returned or rehabilitated or reconciled in some way. And it's almost self-fulfilling, right? The way that Barty Crouch wrote off his son, like literally said, "You're no son of mine," right? And look at the consequences of that, right? Now, I'm super interested in, like, do you think that his son was lying when he was screaming in court saying, "I didn't do it"? And based on the way that he speaks about Voldemort as this like surrogate father, this you know, sick master. But that's beside the point. I think for someone like Draco, keep showing up and giving chances. I mean, not irrationally or naively, but I think that that's a part of it, because but you can't force their hand either, right? Like, I thought it was interesting at the end when everybody was toasting Cedric and toasting Harry. Harry looks over at Draco's table and he sees all of the Slytherins. You know, a lot of them didn't stand up and toast him, right? And that they were whispering when Dumbledore was giving this really beautiful eulogy. And that's sort of like what I do in an assembly, right? I look at like the bad kids who are like not behaving, and you focus on the bad, and I get angry and I get emotional, and but Dumbledore wasn't looking at them. There's like the narrator says that, you know, he just didn't see. Maybe he did see, but he didn't care to look. There were some kids who kind of like weren't on board yet, but it doesn't seem to flap him or make him mad. Like a lesser teacher like myself would have said, "You assholes over there, like, get your goblet in the air and you're going to toast this guy whether you like it or not," right? And like, that doesn't work.
Well, he
and I
seems to
learned that the
respect
hard way.
freedom of the will. He seems to respect
Yes, that's
freedom
exactly
of the
right.
will. And I think the place of Slytherins, he understands them. But you're making me also think about the Christian concepts of grace and redemption through what you're saying, Sarah. You've helped me understand what they mean. Because it seems like what grace is understanding that somebody has the ability to bring more good in the world through their choices in the future, regardless of the bad that they've done in the past, barring something truly unforgivable. But it seems as if for humans, there's nothing unforgivable, at least in the Christian idea, because of the fact that they consciously put their own God to death and he forgave them for it, indicating that all sins would be forgiven, could be forgiven by grace. And I think that's what that means. And then what redemption is sort of what we see Cain having to deal with after killing his brother, that you better use that grace and do some good things after you've made mistakes. And if you have the sort of moral sense of Augustine and you look back on your own life and you look how much grace you've been given because of all the terrible things you've done, like bite other humans when you were young, like an animal, and that I think that's a very sophisticated way of looking at life, that you are never on auto drive so long as you have freedom of will, which you always do so long as you are human, and that you can always do things. Yes. I think maybe as you know, having been steeped in the traditions of the church and the theology of the church, it's hard for me not to read it into this, but that, you know, God, in the theological sense, like God doesn't create obedient humans who have no will. If God wanted to, God could have done that, such that
such that
Those are
we
the
would never sin, and right, yeah, such that we would never sin, and therefore we would never need redemption. There would never have been a need for the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection. None of that would have been necessary if we didn't have choice. But there's something that I think the logical leap is there's something better about chosen devotion or chosen love, and it must be better because that's what God granted, and an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God would choose the better, right? I think
that's the only way that charity can. So if the act of creation is a charitable act, that's the only way the act can be mirrored by another being willfully,
right?
And so that's the only way.
I do think. I was just gonna say, I do think it's about preserving their will, right? Like you can't browbeat somebody into being good, just like apparently you can't browbeat somebody into being bad. I think that's important. I mean, I think that imperial curse is maybe the worst one of them all. I mean, I know the killing and the torturing is bad, but I think that's probably where the fear came from. That like you don't know if your neighbor is under the imperial curse and is like passing. I mean, I can see that one causing mass societal panic, fear. Just that maybe is the one thing that it sounds like it was used pretty often, and then again it was used as like a excuse, like, oh, I didn't mean to. I was under the imperial curse after he fell from grace, like or fell from power, like that curse, that one of the three, though it's presented as the first one, and though it features the least physical pain and maybe the fewest like long-term consequences because you're not dead after it, but it does seem like that one is like the worst to your nature, and that like it is the thing that maybe allowed for somebody to rise beyond their human capacity, like that in concert with his powers made him larger than life, because instead of him being larger than life, it was people being distanced from one another, like fearful of their neighbor and what their neighbor is up to and who their neighbor obeys. That like I don't know, I think there's something in that.
What you're saying just reminds me so much of claims about Germany in the 30s, but even more so about the Soviet Union, that imperious in Latin, just like in English, it comes from the word that was ascribed to Caesar. He was the imperator, where we get the word emperor from. And empire to be an emperor is to be a ruler over many nations, and so to have one's will forced in line. And one who is imperious is one that forces, like you were saying, the students to stand up even if they don't want to. And so this makes me want to ask you the final question, Wes, which is this. Do you think that, and something about the imperious curse, which is interesting, is that it feels so pleasant, it feels so good, that the imperious curse could have a correlate in the primary world of, say, a destructive ideology that one implants in one's mind rather than thinking consciously and being aware and thinking one's own thoughts for oneself, and thus trying to obviate one's responsibility for the situation one finds oneself in.
I mean, I think the connection there between the imperious curse and the idea of an empire would tend to make that connection, right? Like if you sort of have this notion that you've got control simply because you've figured out some stuff about like ruling and government and stuff like that, and you've got a big army, then yeah, that's interesting. It does seem like the tendency for empire to want to kind of worm its way inward is also embedded in the history of Christianity, though. Like there has been a kind of fusion of those two things, of worldly empire and the kind of spiritual world as well. Like that is a big problem that I think is still being worked out as a result. And so I think there's just a lot of complicated elements to that, to like sort of try to understand what is going on in somebody else's head in the first place. It's hard to understand what's going on in your own head. So it's a good question.
Well, all the more important to be honest then, because that's the only way we're going to make out what each of us is all about. Because none of us can tell by ourselves. So I guess we better keep doing this. And we better keep uniting together. And so I guess I have a question, just because this has been a great conversation and we've gone long, and I know, Sarah, you're in the middle of the country, so it's a lot later for you than it is for us. How many chapters would y'all like to read of our next book? And not to pass over the fact that we've just now finished this book and accomplished passing the midpoint of this series. But I would like to read lots of chapters. Just now that I'm listening to Audible, I can fly through books and I'm loving it.
I mean, maybe the first, I don't have the book in front of me, but maybe through like the first 5 chapters or so, if I at least get Harry to the 12 Grimmauld Place, maybe.
Works for me.
What's the 5th chapter there, Alex? Do you have it in front of you?
I don't have it yet. I don't have it in front of me. I do have it on Audible, and I'm a little farther than that so far, just because it's so easy to listen. But
okay.
Wes, do you have it in front of you?
I just pulled it off the shelf here. It looks like the first 6 chapters would make a pretty good first group.
Perfect.
Like,
Great.
yeah, read through the end of chapter 6. Sure.
All right. Well, I can't wait. I don't have a special question for us today. I think we can return to that next time. I think we just had what was special today was just the conversation itself. And I thought this was great, and I appreciate you making the time from the middle of the country, Sarah.
No worries. It's the beginning.
That's right.
It's the beginning. That's a good way of looking at it. And, it's amazing. With so much ground behind us, I guess it is a new beginning every time. And so never to be taken for granted. Each time a unique conversation. And I think that's something, if I could talk to my St. John self, I would say to do better at. Don't take any of the moments for granted. And, maybe I'll apply that to right now too. It's like, I love doing this with y'all. This has been great. I like facing the darkness with y'all.
Yeah. Likewise.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
a good one.
All right.
Keep your heads down, everybody.
Take it easy.